In this video, we're going to be going over background techniques that you can bring into your artwork. The materials that we're going to be using are chalk pastels, oil pastels, watercolor, and a tea stain. Starting with chalk pastels, you'll need a piece of white drawing paper, a tissue, some chalk pastels, and maybe some Q-tips. So I'm going to start by showing you an ombre from dark to light. Chalk pastels are a very bright, colorful, and easily blendable material. I've chosen a magenta pastel to demonstrate for the first part of the video, and you can see I've just used one end of the stick and kind of put it down in a circular motion. And once you have some pastel that is laying on the page, you can literally use your finger to kind of push the dust that's created after the pastel kind of gets kicked up, and really push it down into the page. So using a circular motion, I'm just kind of working the top, pushing all that pigment into the paper, and then as I want to start getting into like a lighter magenta, I'm just bringing that pastel dust down further on the page and allowing just a little bit of the dust to mix with the white of the paper, and so it's kind of creating like a really light pink. To make the color more rich and intense, you just keep on layering the pastel over and over on top of itself. To create lighter versions of the color, you just use less pastel and more white of the paper. Let's try blending multiple colors of chalk pastel together now. I'm starting by layering down some nice rich dark blue. Here I'm demonstrating how you can actually blend with a tissue instead of using your finger. So I kind of wrapped the tissue around my finger, and now I'm kind of wiping and blending that pastel. You'll notice that it gets really, really light. So what happens is a lot of the pastel gets absorbed by the tissue, and so if you choose to blend with a tissue instead of your finger, you're going to get a lighter pastel type of look. Now I know some people don't like the feel of the chalk pastel, so the tissue is the only option. Or you could try using a Q-tip, but you can only blend in very like small areas, or it takes a very long time. So my recommendation for blending is to use your finger. You can really kind of push the pastel down into the page. Now I want to try and transition from a dark blue into a medium blue. So you'll notice that I just took that medium blue pastel and I'm just layering it right on top of the dark blue and using my finger to kind of blend it all together. If I want to transition into an even lighter blue from the medium, I would do the same thing, taking the pastel, blending it right on top, and then using my finger to kind of seamlessly create that transition from a dark to a medium to a light blue. Some characteristics about pastels that are important to know is they're very easy to use, but they can also be quite messy. So you always want to be careful that you're not spreading the dust of the pastel into parts of your drawing that you don't necessarily want it to go. They also cover incredibly quickly. So if you have a large area in your artwork that you want to add some color to, pastel might be a great way to go. Let's experiment with some oil pastels now. Oil pastels are a very vibrant, oily, and waxy art material, and they also blend really, really beautifully. I'm first going to demonstrate how to blend multiple colors to do like a smooth transition. You can try and blend the oil pastels with your fingertips, although in contrast to the chalk pastels, I think it's actually easier to blend oil pastels with the tip of the actual pastel. I'm starting with a transition from a yellow to a yellow-orange. So I've applied the yellow to the page already, and I'm applying the yellow-orange just right underneath of it and going on top of the yellow. And so I'm kind of just going back and forth between the yellow and the yellow-orange in small circular motions, just trying to create like a really nice, smooth, even transition. An important thing to know about oil pastels is that you can't really erase them. Because of their waxy, oily qualities, once they go onto the page, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to remove them. So you want to make sure you have a plan of attack when you're applying your pastels, especially if you're doing a background for another drawing. Oil pastels also will take a little bit longer to apply to a piece of artwork than a chalk pastel, but the quality will be much more vibrant and bold than a chalk pastel will be. Experimenting with both types of pastels will give you the understanding to make an informed decision in case you want to bring pastel into your artwork at some time. Here I'm demonstrating how you can apply pastels to create more of an expressive line in your work. I'm going to be using a variety of colors, applying the pastels in a more of a scribble technique or an expressive line. And so I'm going to be just layering the colors one on top of one another. And as I do this, the colors are starting to blend together, but you still see that line work that I'm creating with my hand. Applying the oil pastels in more of an expressive line technique can also help to create a mood in your artwork. So you can see in this time lapse that the colors can just continually be layered over and over on top of one another, which is a really cool quality about oil pastels. You'll also probably find at one point or another when you're using the pastels that chunks will break off. Just because they're so soft, they're easily breakable, but all those little chunks can still be used. For the last portion of the oil pastel part of the video, I wanted to show you what it looks like when you use the oil pastels on black paper. So you apply them and blend them in pretty much the exact same way as using them on white paper. The color just kind of shows up a little bit differently on the black paper, which can work to your advantage if you want to create like a certain effect or a certain mood in your artwork, or if you just want to play around with a different kind of contrast with the bright color against the black. So something kind of cool to know and something potentially to play around with in the future. So yeah, oil pastels on black paper, try it out. Let's mix it up a little bit and experiment with some watercolor techniques. All right, let's talk about the materials that we're gonna need. First thing, you gotta have a watercolor set. So you can use one of the traditional pad watercolor sets. I'm also gonna be showing you guys some Blick liquid watercolors. They are my favorite. They're extremely bright, really vibrant, and I just really love them. You'll also need a thicker body paper, so watercolor paper or something like a Bristol board, a cup for water, and a variety of paintbrushes. The first technique I'm going to demonstrate is a wet into wet. A wet into wet technique of painting results in a soft, wonderful, spontaneous, and complex effect, which watercolors are well known for. To start, you want to wet the page with just the water, and then you drop the paint into the water, and then the paint pigments will kind of spread out and move wherever there's more water or less water. You can also try like dabbing it in, dipping it in, or just try and gently guide the color with your paintbrush, and just like allow the artisticness of the paint to kind of evolve and develop on its own. This technique allows the colors to spontaneously and surprisingly mix together on the paper, resulting in effects that you don't necessarily plan for, but that usually look really, really beautiful and interesting. When you're allowing colors to mix together on the paper, you do want to keep in mind your knowledge of color theory. So here in the demonstration video, I'm doing kind of like a yellow, orange, and a magenta, so it's keeping that bright, vibrant look. If I mix together orange and blue, however, it would turn brown. So the same rules that apply for color pencil and acrylic paint also apply for watercolor paint. Here I'm demonstrating how to do the technique of blotting. So I'm starting by taking my paintbrush and laying down a flat wash of color, which is just a solid layer of like a single color. If I want to create areas which are light, what I'll do is blot them, and so I'll take a tissue in just a second right here and lay it right down on that watercolor and push it into the page and then remove it. And so some of the watercolor gets sucked up by the tissue, and so you get all these interesting spots of light and darkness, and so the color is kind of changing a little bit, and it can also create cool textures. Here I'm going to demonstrate doing dry brushing. So I'm starting by layering down a layer of flat color. And then as I start to bring the paint down, the paintbrush is starting to dry out a little bit. It has less and less paint on there. And so what I can do is kind of create this really like wispy, textury effect called dry brushing. As with all watercolor techniques, I can do it with a singular color or take another color and layer it on top. So here I'm taking a little bit of that orange and just dragging that paintbrush on top of it. So I'm allowing some of that magenta to kind of peek through the orange and giving it a cool effect. The last two techniques I'm going to show you involve the watercolor and then adding in an additional material. So I'm going to be showing you how to add in salt and then also layering saran wrap on top of watercolor to create special effects. This salt technique will give you spots of white and kind of like a sparkly star kind of look in your watercolor paintings. So I'm starting by layering the color onto the page in the way that I want. And then once I have those colors set, I take just regular table salt and sprinkle it into the watercolor. So wherever the salt lands, you're gonna leave it. Don't mix the salt around or kind of push it. So the salt will start to absorb the watercolor and it will leave like little white spots on the page. It's really beautiful. So in my little blue sample all the way to the left, you can actually see the salt starting to work. Those white spots are starting to emerge. And that happened in just a couple seconds or a couple minutes. So you wanna totally let that salt dry before you brush it off the page. And for the last watercolor technique, I'm gonna show you how to create cool textures using a piece of everyday kitchen saran wrap. So I'm starting by doing a wet into wet technique. Here I have already layered down the water on the paper and just starting to kind of dip my blue and my magenta in and letting the colors do their thing on the paper. You want to make sure that you have a decent amount of water on the paper before you put the saran wrap onto it. So it's a really key ingredient in the wet into wet technique. So I'm just kind of finishing up here. Then I'm going to take the saran wrap and I'm going to layer it right on top and press it into the paint. And you can see that all these different kind of shapes will pop up based on where the saran wrap is laying. And so I'm just going to totally let that set, let that dry, and then in a couple hours I'll remove that and that texture will all be on the paper. So here's a really cool technique using watercolor and a straw. So start by layering some paint on the page in a specific area, and then you take your straw and blow through it, and using your breath you're gonna move the watercolor and it kind of shoots across the page and creates all different like little line explosions, and wherever the lines go and how long they are is kind of a surprise. So it's really fun and super cool. So you can use this technique to bring attention to a certain part of your artwork or make it look like those lines are shooting out from around a particular section. So here I've just drawn a circle and I'm going to use my watercolor in a really controlled way, just dabbing it in little parts around the circle. And then I'm going to blow the watercolor out, and then I'm going to rotate the page and you can see that I'm going to kind of work that watercolor all the way around that little sphere. Here I've had some fun just layering different colors on top of one another and allowing them to mix on the paper, and it gives like a really interesting and artistic and blendy kind of look. Here's an example of a piece of artwork where I used that expressive line technique in. After I painted these expressive eyes, I used that watercolor technique to kind of create a chaotic and really artistic feel in the piece. And our last background technique today is going to be using a tea stain. This effect is going to give you like a vintagey, old, antique-y look to your paper. So you're going to start with a cup of hot water and then some tea bags. I'm just using a variety here. And then once the tea has steeped in the hot water, you're going to take the bag and dab it onto the paper. As you're working, the paper is going to become saturated with the tea. So you just want to make sure that you're using a thicker body paper, a watercolor paper, or a Bristol board. And then just keep dabbing that tea bag all the way around, and you can kind of pour the extra tea back in, move it around, and yeah, you have a tea stain. Hopefully this video gave you some different ideas on ways to approach background in your art pieces, and hopefully you got inspired to try something new. Thanks, and see you next time.